All right, welcome to our session on risks of physical activity in children. Where do we draw the line between acceptable and unacceptable risks? My name's Ian Janssen. I'm embarrassedly winded from doing 1 minute of activity. So excuse me as I catch my breath. I'm from Queen's University in Kingston, and that's about 250 kilometers due east of here. There we go. So the back basis for our presentation is this picture here of a coddled and ultra-protected child. We have this notion now where we want to protect our children and bubble wrap them from all evils and dangers and risks of the world. And three main types of danger we're trying to protect our kids from. The first being strangers, stranger danger. The second, which is more of a concern to children than it is to the parents, whereas the stranger danger would be the opposite, is kids are scared of bullies and to a certain extent gangs. And finally, injuries. So we have both intentional harms and unintentional harms. And of course, when things are risky and considered dangerous, we want to avoid those risks. So ultimately, if we perceive these types of primarily unstructured, unorganized, spontaneous, unsupervised, child-led activities that they do primarily outside, without their parents, without a teacher, without a coach, without an adult following them everywhere they go and giving them rules, this is what's going to happen. And we know what happens when they go inside. These are the types of things that they get lured to. So the objective of our session today is to explore the appropriate balance between the risks of engaging in physical activity and ensuring that children engage in enough physical activity to achieve health benefits. And again, we're particularly interested in today engaging in the types of unstructured, unsupervised, child-led activities like active play and active transportation that for the most part happen outside, but to some extent can happen indoors as well. Our schedule, I'll start off by giving a 20-minute or so presentation on the perceptions of risk and how those perceptions can determine the child's physical activity level and how the perceptions probably don't align with the reality of what risk actually is. I'll then turn it over to Will Pickett, who's going to talk about the notion that not all injuries are bad, that some injuries we might think of as being acceptable injuries are positive injuries. And he's going to present the two sides of that coin from an injury prevention standpoint. And finally, we're going to turn it over to Sue Scott, who's going to give us an interesting sort of story or case study of a situation where a heightened risk perception really ultimately had an impact on physical activity of children at her place of work. And then we'll have a nice period at the end for questions and discussions. So I'm going to introduce myself again. I'm Ian Janssen. I'm a professor of kinesiology and public health at Queen's University. My research focuses on the determinants and health outcomes of physical activity and sedentary behavior in children. And I'm here today to talk to you about the perceptions of risk and safety. Do our fears reflect reality? Who here thinks the answer is yes? Well, who here thinks the answer is no? Okay, so most people said no, a few non-responses. I could do some very fancy multiple imputation to figure out what the others would be. We can talk about that another day. Here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about. 4 main points. So first, I want to drive home the points that perceptions of risk, irrespective of real risk, influence physical activity, particularly unstructured physical activities like active play and active transportation that could occur in the home neighborhood. Second point, that unstructured outdoor physical activities are for the most part promoted as being very unsafe and very risky, things that children should not be doing. Third, I'll talk about how perceptions of risk in the home neighborhood are very high by both children and parents, and how these are getting worse over time. And finally, I'm going to talk about the disconnect between what risk really is and what we perceive the risk to be. So let's start off by talking about perceptions of risk in the home neighborhood and how they influence physical activity. So I sort of use this as my picture to sort of convey what my message is going to be. My message is going to be, irrespective of whether you are a cat or a lion, if you see yourself as a lion and you see the danger as a lion, that's going to have an impact on you. And that's true with the outdoor environment and physical activity. I'm going to start by a study here, which was done in 19,000 kindergarten students in the United States. And if you pay attention to the data, the two bars in the middle, that's the cross-sectional analysis, so sort of the analysis done at these children in kindergarten, and they asked the parents of these children, do you think your neighborhood is safe or unsafe? So yes or no, safe or unsafe. And the dark bar represents sort of the physical activity level in the safe neighborhoods, and the lighter bar represents the physical activity level in the unsafe neighborhoods. The bars on the right represent a longitudinal analysis predicting physical activity levels 9 years later. So it's a 9 years longitudinal analysis, and you see in both situations, neighborhoods that are perceived as being safe by the parent, the children are more active than the neighborhoods that are being perceived as being unsafe. Now I want to point out here that this study measured overall physical activity. So total physical activity. It's not limited to active play or active transportation, includes organized sport, phys ed at school, things like that. And a lot of the studies in the literature do that. They measure overall physical activity, and there's quite a balance of whether you see positive results or negative or null findings in the literature. What we do know is when you have a more specific measure of physical activity, a measure that's getting at the physical activity that you would be doing in your neighborhood outdoors, at home, we see much more consistent and strong relationships. So if you want to see perceptions influencing physical activity, make sure you measure the very specific type of physical activity you think it's going to be impacting. So parents' perceptions are important. So too are young people's perceptions. This is some of our research out of Canada, 7,000 6th to 10th graders in Canada. In this situation, we asked these youth 5 questions about the safety of their neighborhood as they perceived it. This related to stranger danger and traffic safety. We then used those 5 questions to come up with a scale of safety in the neighborhood as they perceived it, and it sort of ranged from the most safe to the least safe. And we looked at separately in boys and girls, and you can see it doesn't matter what the gender. We see this nice sort of graded relationship as we move from the most safe perceived neighborhoods to the least safely perceived neighborhoods. The physical activity that these young persons performed outside in their free time, outside of school hours, went down. In other words, as safety perceptions decrease, so does physical activity. Makes sense. I'd also like to point out that these relationships superseded any relationships that we saw for any of the many built environment measures that we obtained in that study. Independent and stronger than anything that we saw for any measure of parks, recreational facilities, street connectivity, you name it. These measures of perceived safety trumped all of that. This was done in the 2006 Health Behavior in School-Age Children Survey. We've recently repeated that in the 2010 version of that survey. So different set of kids done 4 years later, 19,000 children in this situation. Same questions on safety, so not surprising, we see that same relationship with perceived safety. In this situation, we also measured crime in their neighborhood, an objective measure of crime from National Crime Surveys and Statistics. So in this situation, we saw that perceived safety predicted physical activity independent of crime. So independent of the number of assaults and sexual assaults and homicides and other crimes against person that were happening in the neighborhood, perceived safety was important. And not only that, perceived safety was a more consistent and stronger predictor of physical activity than was actual risk as measured by crime statistics. So again, the perceptions were more important than the real risk as measured with objective crime data. So second point I want to talk about is unstructured outdoor physical activities are promoted as being unsafe. And here I'm not going to base this part on science. I'm just going to give you some examples. It's late in the day. I think it's easier just to show some pictures. And my main message here is that the message that we are given is that these types of activities are dangerous. And it's very easy to pick on parks, not the nice natural parks, Adam, if you're in here, that you designed, but the artificial parks that we see, and the signs, that you see. Required to have your parent if you want to play here. Play at your own risk. Just think of the message that this is sending us. This must be dangerous. I'm sure this meets all CSA regulations and standards, et cetera, but that's the message that we're sending out. I see these stickers on all the playground equipment in Kingston, in my city of Kingston, including the playground in my park, for children ages 5 to 12 years. I would say that most of the children I see playing on these parks are from the ages 1 to ages 8. I don't see any 12-year-olds. And trust me, I have a 3-year-old daughter, and she is perfectly capable of doing every single thing that we have in our local park in Kingston. And this is my daughter, when she was 6 months old, baby swing for a 5-year-old, I guess. So it just, I don't know how you get I now try and put her in there. She'll say big girl swing or baby swing, and I can't get her out. Her feet get stuck in the holes. So it's just ridiculous, these types of things. But again, the message is that it's unsafe. My son started school this year, and he starts coming home every month with a new safety book. And the one on school buses, it was great to go through it with him, and a lot of them made perfect sense, but there's this one on playground safety, basically telling children how they should play. And this is one of my favorite types of messages that you see in this. Play it safe, sit, don't stand. I think they mean specifically sit on the swings, don't stand on the swings, but trust me, I see kids doing on their stomachs, on their butts, on their feet, you name it, not on their heads yet. I haven't seen that one, but I've yet to see any catastrophic injuries. And I think that kids are going to play they want to play, and that it's okay in most situations. I don't think I need to say much about this. My only comments here is that this is made by a very reputable company and sold at very reputable stores, and you could see how it's being marketed. I guess the dirt and the trees and the grass in this backyard are dangerous. These children in these pictures would all be breaking the rules in the situation that's being shown. So think of the message that, as Dr. Spence mentioned in his presentation last night, it's like a part of your Canadian heritage to play road hockey or street hockey. And it's very simple. You put a net in there, and when the cars come by, everybody else car, and the guy who's playing goalie pulls the net to the side. It's very simple. Not a problem at all, but most municipalities in Canada, certainly the large municipalities, ban playing games like this in the street altogether. In Kingston, there's a set of rules that's 2 pages long if you want to play street hockey that tells you how close you can be to the intersection, what times of day it can be at, how long you're allowed to play, rules around play. It's just absolutely ridiculous. The picture of the boy in the treehouse. If you wanted to build that treehouse in the city of Kingston and most other places, you would have to get a permit. You'd have to pay for that permit. You'd have to have a building inspector come at several points along the process. And you'd follow the same standards as if you were building a house, because as soon as you build anything off the ground, of course, you meet completely different standards. Picture on the bottom corner. This is a school in Toronto that has banned all balls, with the exception of Nerf or sponge balls, on their playgrounds. And this is not because a child was hurt. This is because a parent was hit in the head and had a mild concussion. So, these are situations. Think of what you're telling your children about play. I think that these types of walking school bus initiatives help us overcome barriers, so I don't want to speak too negatively about them, but I think that sometimes the message is that it is very unsafe for children to walk on their own. This picture was taken in a small city, residential neighborhood, no major roads or anything like that, 3 kids to 1 adult ratio. The sidewalk is 6 feet from the road, and look at the reflective vests that the children have to wear when they do this. So very dangerous even to walk with adults holding their hand, I guess, when you're going to school. I put this up here to say, we need to put some of this in context. If you go to Kenya, you've got to worry about getting eaten by lions and trampled by elephants. And also to say that a lot of this is really specific to the North American and some parts of Europe, and that in the developing world, and even some developing countries, these notions of what we think as being safe and unsafe would be very, very different. What about stranger danger? I was checking the weather about a month ago in Kingston, and we had a very painful long winter, and I was thinking this alert came up, that red band, alert. Amber alert, and I thought, oh great, we're in for a late winter storm, or maybe a tornado or who knows what it was. So I clicked on the alert, and it actually was a child was reported missing in Toronto. And this was I was in Kingston, 250 kilometers away, and yet we're receiving this Amber Alert about a child reported missing in Toronto. It was his mother was the one that he was with. This is a mother had lost child privileges, and she was child supervisory privileges, and she's the one that took her child. He was thankfully returned later on that day. But I put this up there because I hear probably every 2 or 3 weeks in Kingston on the news, I hear something about some child being approached in a car. Then 2 days later, it turns out that it was their neighbor that was approaching him in the car, and they didn't recognize the neighbor, and they overreacted. But you hear this stuff all the time. So certainly I think that the message is that it's very unsafe for children to be outside, especially if they're outside on their own. So let's now talk about perceptions of risk in the home neighborhood, how these are high and how these are getting worse. And I will use this cartoon here to illustrate this point. The Man of Steel, Superman, don't jump, it is too risky. Even though you're made of steel and you can fly, that 6-inch distance is too far for you. I'm going to here use some data out of Australia to illustrate this point. And this is data from a study of 10 to 12-year-old boys and girls from several schools in Australia. And here they interviewed the children and the parents of the children. And one of the questions they asked both the parents and the children is, do you think road safety, are you concerned about road safety in your neighborhood? And irrespective of whether the child was a boy or a girl, 80% of the parents said, yes, I'm concerned about road safety in my neighborhood. And about 35% of the children. So clearly the parents are more worried than the kids. Almost all of the parents are concerned, and about a third of the kids were concerned here. What about stranger danger? So same study. Now the question is, are you concerned about strangers in your home neighborhood? Again, 80% of the parents, whether their child was a boy or a girl, said yes, they were concerned about strangers in their home neighborhood. This was a problem. And about 40% of boys and about 50% of girls were concerned about strangers in their neighborhood. So clearly, there's some perceptions here of risk. This is some data out of Canada in our HBSC survey that I've talked about before. In this situation, we asked these 6th to 10th graders, what are some factors that would encourage you to engage in active transportation or make active transportation for you easier? And, 60 to, about 75% said, if there was less traffic, it would make it a lot easier for me to engage in active transportation. If there were safe road crossings, it would be easier for me to engage in active transportation. If there were no bullies out there, it would make it easier for me to engage in active transportation. And we've done GIS assessments of the environments of where these children live. And there are problems, don't get me wrong, there are some problems. There's lots of things that we could work on to make these environments more safety. But most of these children live in residential areas with low-speed roads. There are crosswalks and things like that. There are sidewalks. Again, there are things that we could work on to make it better and improve on. But for the most part, these environments would be considered fairly safe. And I'm going to show some data on bullying later on, and I don't think the rates of bullying are at 70%. Not only are these concerns of safety bad, they are getting worse as time goes on. This slide here is showing 4 different cycles of a cross-sectional survey, the General Social Survey. And here I've pulled out the data only for those people that were parents of young children, so parents of children aged 14 and under in this situation. And in each cycle, they were asked, has crime in your neighborhood stayed the same? Has it gotten worse? Or has it gotten better? And in each cycle, 93, 99, 2004, 2009, only about 3% of these parents believed that crime had improved, had gone down in their neighborhood in the last 5 years. About half, maybe slightly more than half in some of the cycles said that it stayed the same. But it's where you see this huge chunk, about a third, 25%, 35%, depending on the year, felt that crime got worse. And look at the disconnect between the red bar and the blue bar. So clearly there's this perception, more people think crime is getting worse than think crime is getting better. That's what parents think. What about young people? So this is, again, more data from the Health, Behavior, and School-Age Children Survey. So this is 3 cross-sectional surveys, 6th to 10th graders. Same question asked in all 3 surveys of a very similar population group. And the question was, do you think, is it safe for young children to play outside during daylight hours in your neighborhood? Do you disagree? Are you not sure, neutral, or do you agree with that statement? And you can see that over time, the percentage of children who agree with that statement has gone down, and the percentage of children who are not sure or disagree with that statement has gone up. So in other words, over time, the perceptions of children that it being safe for them to play outside is decreasing, and this is data from right here in Canada. So last point I want to raise, there's this disconnect between risk perception and reality. And here I'm going to really draw on 2 lines of evidence. I'm going to first do some comparisons of points. What I'm going to show is changes in crime over time and risk over time, and compare that to the perceptions that we just talked about. Remembering the perceptions were that things are getting worse, and I'm going to show you how things are actually getting better. I also am going to present some points of thought about how the indoor environment, while we think of it as being extremely safe, also poses lots of risks and danger. It's not just outside, it's inside as well. So this is my slide for this one. I think how the kid experiences it, that's the reality of it, but we see things as being very, very bad, particularly mom. My wife would be like, the kid would be actually above the screen, I think, on that. So here's changes in crime rates for crimes against person in Canada since 1994, and these trends would have started in the 1970s and 1980s and continued to go down. So whether it be assaults in the green, homicides in the red, non-parent child abductions in the yellow, or sexual assaults in the purple, these have all decreased in the past few decades. I want to talk a bit more about the child abductions because I think that's important. And here we've teased out the non-parent child abductions. Quick question, who do you think the people are that are the most likely to abduct children? Their parents, right? The parents. So the vast majority of child abductions in Canada, the vast, vast, vast majority are parents. So if you're a parent and you want to know who the person is that's most likely to abduct your child, think about who their other parent is, their other biological parent. That's the answer. So what about the non-parent? And that could be anybody. It could be the grandmother, the grandfather, the aunt, the uncle, the neighbor, somebody they know, or a complete stranger. And it's the complete strangers that people are worried about. So we call that the stereotypical child abduction. A complete stranger takes a child and does harm to them. Maybe there's an assault, a sexual assault, or even worse case scenario, a homicide. So the last time we've actually gone through and done a very detailed analysis of those non-parent child abductions in Canada was in 2001, 2002. And I believe that the picture has not gotten worse since that time. So you can all read the question. Within Canada, how many 0 to 14-year-old children were abducted by a stranger, a complete stranger, between 2001 and 2002? So that's a 2-year period. That's 5.6 million children would fall into that age range. And here's our possible answers. So who here thinks it's A, 1, about 1? So a few of you. Who here thinks it's B, about 10? Say most of you. Who here thinks it's about 100? Hardly anybody. And who here thinks it's 1,000? 1. So that means on an annual basis, your risk of being abducted if you're a child is 1 in 11 million on an annual basis. That's like, your odds of winning the lottery, 649. This just doesn't happen. This just doesn't happen. And when it does happen, you hear about it repeatedly for several years in the news. These things just don't exist in Canada. Oh, they do exist, and they're tragic, right? Tori Stafford. I feel for her parents. I feel for her family. I feel for her loved ones. But these are exceptionally, exceptionally rare in Canada. Child luring through the internet, this does not happen outside. This happens inside. And these are statistics from 2008. I don't know what they are in 2014. I'm sure they've gone up. And I'm sure that these cases are drastically underreported. There's lots that parents don't know. So the inside environment is much more provocative and dangerous for child predators than is the outdoor environment. I think also the technology provides a safety mechanism in the outside. There's data out of the UK showing that, one of the main determinants of whether children will let their kids go outside unsupervised is whether or not they have a cell phone. You can actually track your children if you want to with the Find My Phone apps, If you don't know where they are, you can figure out where they are by using that application. I'm not encouraging you to do that. Give your kids some privacy, but if you feel you must, you can do that. You can plan safe routes to school using lots of wonderful applications. So you can use the technology in a way to make the environment safer. Rates of physical bullying in Canada, and you can see 3 cycles of the survey, 2002, 2006, 2010, have not changed one lick. Physical bullying has remained consistent at around 15% have experienced some form of physical bullying. A lot of this is, they've been hit, kicked, punched, something like that. Important, I'm not saying it's not important, but it's not getting worse, as you might think. I don't think this existed 15 years ago, cyberbullying, and in fact, the rates of cyberbullying are much higher than they are for physical bullying, and the consequences of cyberbullying, they're just really starting to understand that. But again, this is something that happens indoors. You're not safe from bullying if you're indoors. You're not completely safe if you're outdoors, but the same happens when you're indoors. Well, clearly injuries must be getting worse. I'm going to congratulate the injury epidemiologists because they've made the most dramatic improvements in any public health issue, I think, of anything outside of perhaps smoking rates in the past few decades. This is showing unintentional injury deaths in Canada from 1990 to 2005. The trends have continued over the last decade. Trust me on that. The top line represents all unintentional injury deaths, and you see that that is almost decreased in half over that time span. The green line, the middle line in the middle, that's the leading cause of death in children is motor vehicle and transportation accidents. By far the leading cause of unintentional injury deaths in Canada is motor vehicle and transportation. The things at the bottom are like drowning, poisoning, falls. And you can actually go into Statistics Canada and actually get data on what the drownings are. And most of these drownings are not drownings outside, unsupervised. These are drownings in bathtubs. These are leaving young children alone unsupervised in bathtubs and drowning in bathtubs. The falls, they're not falls from playground structures, falls from cliffs. Those things are zeros, maybe ones when you look at the different years, the number of kids in all of Canada. That's just very, very, very rare, those types of things. And I want to pay a bit more attention to that green line there, motor vehicle and transportation, because maybe you're saying, well, maybe it's the kids are getting hit by the cars and not the kids that are in the cars. So the bottom line, the green line again is motor vehicle and transportation. The orange line below that represents the motor vehicle and transportation deaths that are happening if you are an occupant in the vehicle. So look at where most of those deaths are. It's if you're in the car. Not if you're out on the street as a pedestrian, which is the pinkish line there, or if you're a pedal cyclist, which is the blue line at the very bottom. And look at 2005, where those numbers end up at. They are almost at zero. There's about a handful of these deaths in Canada in recent years. Every year you get less than a handful of children dying by being hit by a car if they're a pedestrian, or dying if they've been hit by a car or other means if they are a cyclist. Now you might say that that's because children aren't outside. That's true, but certainly we don't have nearly the problem that we did 20 or 30 years ago. And you might be saying maybe that these improvements in injury deaths, maybe it's because we have better emergency service. We can get to the kids faster, and we can treat them better in the ER. So maybe that's what it's all about. So what about just injury hospitalizations? And we see the exact same trends. So yes, we have better emergency care, but we also see that kids are getting the hospitalizations are going down, very similar patterns. And what is in fact leading to injuries in kids when they are being active? And this is part of our health behavior in school-age children survey. About 50% of children report that they've experienced a medically treated injury within the past year in this survey. And this is just showing the breakdown of what the causes are of those injuries, what they were doing when they were injured. And look at what's driving that on the left. It's not unsupervised, unstructured play, active transportation. It's things that they are doing that have rules, have regulations, have parental supervision, coaches, referees, things like that. It's the organized sport. Don't get me wrong, there are injuries that happen when kids engage in active play and active transportation, but they are nothing compared to the injuries that happen when they engage in organized sport. And don't think at all for 1 second that the indoor environment is void of risk. Poisons, knives, and tools. I was actually shocked to see how many children are hurt by falling off of bunk beds, whether sleeping or when they're playing. Children getting large pieces of equipment, furniture and televisions falling on them. The picture on the bottom right, I think I did that when I was a kid, and well, there was a few injuries. We didn't end up going to the hospital, but there's definitely some bumps and bruises. And the picture on the top right, that's mold. And I do that to say there's lots of toxins in the indoor environment that you may or may not experience if you're outside. So let's wrap this up with a summary of the key messages. First off, the perceptions of risk influence the physical activity of children. I think there's no doubts about that. If you have a specific measure of physical activity, that you will see that. And unstructured outdoor physical activities like active play and active transportation are promoted as being unsafe. Perceptions of risk of being outside and doing things that are not supervised is high, and they're certainly getting worse over time. I think that actual risk is, on the contrary, very low and in fact is improving. And because of this disconnect, I think the main thing that we need to be focusing on right now is addressing that disconnect. And it's just basic knowledge. People, parents, caregivers, they just need to understand that the world is not as risky as we're making it out to be. And I'm going to leave you with this quote, Daniel Defoe, the author of The Life and Times of Robinson Crusoe: "Fear of danger is 10,000 times more terrifying than danger itself." And thank you for your attention. So we'll have a general discussion and question period at the end. If you could bring up the next slide deck, please. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Will Pickett. I consider Will to be a good friend, a good colleague, a very good mentor. He's also now my boss. He's the Director of Public Health Sciences at Queen's University. And that's not why I'm saying all the good things about him, trust me. Will has a very, very productive research program in the area of injury prevention with the focus on rural and farm injuries and unintentional injuries in children, and is a very modern thinker in the area of injury prevention. And he's not the enemy here, trust me, he's our friend, and he's going to talk to us about perspectives from the injury prevention field. So I'll turn it over to Will.
Thanks, Ian. Hard guy to follow. It was my job or assignment to give some perspective on this issue from the world of injury prevention. I do a lot of stuff in pediatrics and with kids, and I have worked in the area of injury prevention for quite a while. And what I'm going to try and do is address this disconnect that Ian referred to. So what we'll cover together in my 15 or 20 minutes, I'm going to offer 2 health promotion perspectives. I've got 3 thoughtful ideas surrounding this issue, and then some key messages to take away from my talk. So, injury control sometimes gets a bad rap, and it comes from this perspective. Traditionally, we view injuries not being as accidents, and everything is predictable and preventable if you understand the circumstances leading to them. And there's a tenet out there: we should actually protect children from physical hazards at all costs. And that's been very valuable in some circumstances. And in other circumstances, I think it's hurt us as a profession. We get this negative stereotype. Ian used the same image. I'm not sure if you got it from my presentation or if you got it off the same Google thing I did, but that we wrap our children, you know. This kid has the helmet, the signage, the bubble wrap, and we protect them. We protect them physically, we protect them emotionally. Lots of dangers associated with that. And if there's a downside of my discipline, it's that. There is an upside. Ian did a very nice job of looking at some of the injury statistics. And if you look at these in Canada, these happen to be fatal rates of injury from motor vehicle crashes. You'll see trends like this, and that's not a coincidence. We have better cars, we have better design, we have better behaviors surrounding how people use vehicles. We have better rules and regulations, graduated licensing, lots of progressive things that have helped. And my profession has contributed to that. So that's good. And I think if you look at this girl in the car, no one's going to argue that seatbelts aren't a good thing, or that there's been progress in the design of vehicles to keep that child safe if in an injury event. And I can remember when I was a kid climbing all over the place and hanging out the back window. That doesn't happen anymore. These are positive developments for a major serious trauma problem that the injury prevention community has contributed to. And this is an extreme example, but we've got good labor regulations that respect children and their rights as children, and to do work that is developmentally and age appropriate. And there has been a backlash about child labor and dangerous practices. The injury prevention world has made a major contribution that way globally. And Ian, you used this picture for her looking outdoors. I was going to use it as there's been good design contributions from the injury prevention world. Design in terms of building standards to protect children from falls and high rises, structural things that we can do to protect from major trauma. And I don't think anybody's going to argue against the benefits of some of those things. But I think as a community we need cautions, and what we're here today to talk about is sort of the disconnect between the injury prevention world and the physical activity promotion efforts that you're all involved in. And I think we have to stop and take a deep breath when you see one competing against the other and not working together in tandem. So I wanted to step back and say, well, what shapes the injury prevention perspective on things? And I wanted to say, my colleagues and I share some fairly well-reasoned principles. Injury is costly and burdensome. It's right up there with obesity in terms of its cost to society. Injuries are preventable. We got lots of good models for that, whether that's through education or design changes or rules and regulations. Children are vulnerable to injury, and children deserve our protection. But the downside of injury prevention is when you go to extremes, like any sort of fundamentalist thing. If it's overdone, you're going to constrain the growth and healthy development of children. You're going to produce kids that don't understand risk and are non-resilient. And we see them at university now. They can't cope. There are limits to their imagination. There are limits to their physical activity. And we're breeding a generation of kids that are missing out on life. So I want to flip this and look at first, what is the perspective from the physical activity world? And I love this picture. And I think Sue's going to talk about a similar type of picture. This is a school in the States that actually promotes active play as part of their curriculum. And there are hazards associated with that, but there's an awful lot of good there too. The perspective from this discipline is that physical activity always contributes to healthy growth and development. And our kids are sometimes deprived of necessary experiences to thrive. Over-supervision of children can be stifling and inhibit growth. And the sort of hitch about this is that minor injuries, they can be expected, and they're not necessarily always unhealthy if kids are engaged in healthy, life-giving activities. It's just a matter of predicting what circumstances are going to result in minor things and what are going to result in major things. There's obvious benefits to active play and physical activity in terms of fitness, subtle benefits in terms of emotional health with things like connection with nature. But you have to keep in mind that there should be some necessary cautions around that in terms of major trauma, disability, and fatality associated with injury. So what shapes this perspective? My view is that it also has well-reasoned principles. The costs of inactivity in children are very high. Overprotection of children is costly too. Stifled growth and development are unacceptable risks, and minor injuries should be an acceptable consequence of an active lifestyle. So a little bit of self-reflection from both perspectives. For injury prevention specialists, the world I come from, when have our protections been taken to an unreasonable extreme? And we end up with kids like this. And for physical activity specialists, when have our health promotion efforts been taken to an unreasonable extreme? And kids end up there. So we all need to take a deep breath. What are we worried about? Well, there are injury-related issues that are worrisome. Death, trauma, disability. So things like major head injury and neck injury, neurotrauma, major fractures, major lacerations, spinal cord injuries, asphyxiation, poisonings, intentional injury and abuse. And we've got lots of death statistics and injury statistics in Canada. We know what kills kids. We know what puts them in hospital in a trauma ward. And it is things like Ian pointed out, motor vehicle crashes, fires, drownings, poisonings. You don't see physical activity-related injury up there. Where you see that is in the emergency department, or you might see it in self-reported injuries that are generally of a minor nature. What should we not be worried about? Minor bumps and scrapes, lacerations, sprains and strains, things that are part of normal life. From a physical activity end of things, what should we be worried about? The ravages of physical inactivity and any effort that tries to sustain it. Stifled opportunities for healthy growth and development, whether that's physically, emotionally, or cognitively, and unhealthy long-term trajectories. So obviously there's a need for balance between our professions to achieve what we're all hoping for, which is long-term healthy growth in kids. And we need evidence. It's remarkable how little evidence there is that's solid around some of these issues. And we talk from our experience and our values in the absence of evidence. So I've got 3 thoughtful ideas, I hope they're thoughtful anyway, to contribute to this debate. And the first was an idea that a colleague from Ireland, Dr. Michael Mocha and myself put forward to our injury prevention colleagues is there an idea of an acceptable injury in the world? And how we tried to define this was using standard things that we use in measuring injury. And the first is intent. It would first of all have to be unintentional, non-intentional. Second is non-severe. The severity would have to be modest. The activity would be health generating. The mechanism would be normative, and we kind of got in trouble for this one because it depends on your perspective, but that something out of the norm hasn't happened to have it occur. And if there were known prevention measures, that they were in place at the time. And if an injury happened and had those criteria, it would be acceptable. So a kid falls from this rock and has a minor abrasion that occurs. To me, it's acceptable. Non-intentional, non-severe. It was in a health-generating behavior, not an extreme risk. And the kid was wearing gloves and pants and had the appropriate protective gear on. There are also unacceptable injuries. And these are ones where they were intentional in occurrence, at an extreme homicide, what it could be an assault or an abuse. severe severity in terms of trauma score or an injury severity score. The activity involved was out of the norm. It was typically risk-generating and involved a dangerous or risk-taking mechanism, or there was non-adherence to known preventive measures. So as Ian said, I've done a lot of work in rural trauma with kids. This is a 6-year-old driving an old farm tractor. This might be an example of an unacceptable injury. While it was unintentional, certainly these traumas are really severe, often kills the child. The activity involved is age inappropriate. They don't have the developmental abilities to handle that tractor when something goes wrong cognitively. There was serious energy transfer in terms of a mechanism. It rolls and crushes the child. And there's no roll bar in place, so there's non-adherence to known preventive measures. So it's sort of an extreme example of something that would be unacceptable. So we bounced this idea off our injury prevention colleagues, and I was actually quite surprised at how positive the reaction was to this. Feedback we got was that it respected multiple health perspectives, that no one wants a nanny state or no one wants injury prevention to actually become irrelevant as a field because we're too demanding in terms of our prevention methods. Some of the old guard, I think, said that there were some negative reactions. One of the good arguments is that minor injuries may not be minor. We may not be able to predict between the one that causes a minor bump to the head and something that's a serious neurotrauma. That's fair enough. They said our matrix was too complicated. They questioned the norms that we were using in our matrix. And then, of course, we heard, where's the evidence in support of your ideas? We just threw it out as an idea. But basically, the implication is that if you buy into the concept of an acceptable injury as a philosophy, it provides a starting point for a conversation between fields and that we can work together. Second idea that is, I think, useful is what I've called holistic thinking, and lots of people use that term holistic in lots of different ways. I went back to the roots of the word. It comes from Plato and Socrates, and it's looking at something as a constellation, or if you're thinking of a child, you're looking at the whole human being and not just its constituent parts. This applies to the field of health promotion. We should be looking at the whole child and health promotion for the whole child, not injury prevention versus obesity versus physical activity. But let's get together and actually work as a composite, as fields. As I said, it's an ancient concept. Our standard definitions of health consider health as a composite measure. It also has indigenous roots. There's a thing called the medicine wheel that looks very similar to this, which is this happens to be a variant of the World Health Organization definition of health. But the reality is that in our disciplines, we work in silos. And we don't actually talk to each other, and sometimes we occasionally fight in terms of perspective. We've got to get over that. So issue 2 around holism, recognize that our thinking is very compartmentalized. In the big picture, injury prevention and physical activity professions, they're not separate fields. They're part of the same field. And perhaps if we should cooperate, consolidate good ideas, and start to work together. And the third idea I think that's useful in this debate is around active, safe, I've called it risky play, which you'll be interested to know people in my profession, in the injury prevention world, are starting to actually embrace. We all know the benefits of active play in terms of long-term healthy development. A lot of good to it. Last November, we had our national conference, Canadian Injury Prevention and Safety Promotion Conference. There was a half-day symposium on the concept of active play as it applies to injury. It involved a lot of discussion, a lot of paradigm shifts, and a couple of standing ovations. People are actually seeing value in this, so don't judge a field by a couple of case events. Positive reaction, seen as a touch of realism in a very controlled profession. Some hardcore injury prevention specialists actually are embracing this idea, and we're starting to work together on some of these concepts. I think that's good. Negative reactions, some people would see this as a bit of a sellout of our principles. I think it's fair to say that we can't ignore serious trauma if we can predict it, and we should never forget that. We may be putting children at risk in certain circumstances, and we have to remember that. And of course, we heard the where is the evidence argument that you hear if you're going to adopt things like active play. So those are necessary cautions. But the implications of that idea is if you accept it, the benefits of active play in such initiatives are pretty clear. We can't forget about trauma and major injuries in this, but an overreaction is unhelpful from either field. So I'll leave you with 5 key messages from my end of things and then turn it over to Sue. I would say each of our professions is actually quite principled, well-intentioned, and has good roots. There's a need for balance in our perspectives. The physical activity world can't ignore statistics about major injuries. And similarly, the injury prevention world can't ignore the negative health implications of treating all injuries as serious. There is no consensus about where one draws the line as to what is serious injury, and it's something that we need to work on. And as health professionals, we need to work together and resolve this and not continue to work in opposition. So that's my 2 bits, and Sue's next. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Will, and it's my pleasure to introduce our final speaker today, Sue Scott. Sue is the General Manager at Cardell Place in Calgary, Canada. As Sue spoke about this morning, Cardell Place is really a pioneer in these types of large recreation centers where they're actually moving away from this focus on organized sport and moving towards embracing active play. Everybody got one of these things in their package, and I'm sure most of you, when you registered, are wondering, what is the significance of this spongy rock that says Cardell Place on it? Well, Sue's going to tell you a story about this rock and why, for her, this was a necessity form of stress relief. So I liked her thing today, get out of the way, let them play. So I'm going to borrow that quote often, Sue.
Thanks, Ian. It always bums me out that I have to pull these down, even with 6-inch heels on. So hopefully everybody can hear me and I don't blast you out of the room. So it's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon to share this story with you. It's meant to be compelling and provocative and hopefully memorable for all of you. So I hope you enjoy it. I'm going to start with a question. What do you get when you combine a provincial health authority with a zero-risk policy or philosophy to kids' play with a bold and innovative organization who not only allows but actually encourages kids to explore and play on a bunch of natural sandstone rocks in a recreation facility? And it isn't a joke. It's a huge public policy conflict and a tremendous leadership platform to advocate for kids' right to play. So I'm sure most of you were at the session this morning, so you have a little bit of context about what Cardell Place is, but I'll just go over it briefly for those of you that maybe slept in and just give you a little bit of context about the players. So Cardell Place is a social enterprise. We're a very, very large regional recreation facility in north central Calgary, and we very much value and achieve strong social and financial bottom lines. And we have since day one, since 2004. We're just celebrating our 10th year. And our mission, as you can see on all the signage, is raising healthier generations. And we're very, very passionate about it and very proud of it. And as stewards of one of Calgary's leading regional rec centers, we're really trying to pioneer a different way of thinking and acting when it comes to recreation. Our sector has been doing the same thing for decades, and we don't even really know what long-term success we're having with what we're doing. So we're trying to shake things up a lot. And so we're very non-traditional, as I mentioned this morning, and we're really a dynamic, high-energy community hub. We have a very broad, very young, multicultural community, and we really work hard to make sure that people feel holistically healthy and well, and they're connected and cared for when they come to the organization or the facility. So we're very much catalysts. We're committed to developing public policy and really committed to shifting community values, behaviors, and attitudes and beliefs about holistic, healthy living. So within the main lobby of our facility, we have a large grouping of sandstone rocks, and it's a little hard to give perspective, but I think you'll get the picture here pretty clearly. They're about 25 feet long, they're about 12 feet wide, and about 2 to 3 feet high. And they were intended to be a meeting and gathering place for the community, for customers. And it was meant to bring some of the natural environment into the that's very local to that area into the facility, and they're lovely. And of course, kids naturally gravitate to them to climb and play on them. And the Provincial Health Authority, which for those of you that are from Alberta know is called Alberta Health Services, they have jurisdiction over the safety of play areas and other things too. I mean, they come in, they test our pool water, etc. And they look at our food and beverage operations. But when areas where children play that aren't necessarily playgrounds are actually only inspected by the Provincial Health Authority when there's a complaint. And in 2012, a complaint was filed with AHS by a customer who purportedly saw somebody get injured on these rocks, and that in turn led to a formal investigation by the health authority. And it was interesting because actually we have a very, very solid injury and accident reporting system and process in place, and that injury was not reported to us. So to our surprise, the rocks have become a very powerful symbol of bureaucracy and rules run amok in our estimation, and a sad example of where heightened adult perceptions of risk have really significantly and negatively impacted the ability of children to engage in active play. So a little bit about this story. So during Alberta Health Services investigation, they had 5 complaints or 5 concerns that were raised. So you can see that they're on a concrete floor, right? They don't have any form of proper protective padding or surfacing around the perimeter. There's lots of openings where kids can easily get a limb caught and twist an ankle or break a limb. So that was the second issue. The third concern was that the rocks are piled on top of each other, and some have very sharp edges, I would say very sharp, and that a child could be seriously injured if they fell from one rock onto another. The fourth concern was that the rocks do not have a non-slip surface, obviously, therefore slipping on them is possible. And then the fifth concern is that the rocks posed a tripping hazard, the smaller rocks. So after a failed attempt at reaching a collaborative and mutually acceptable resolution, and after receiving numerous inspection reports and orders to close the rocks to climbing and play, and after a very bold attempt to disregard the health authority's direction altogether, yeah, I know I look like a kitten, but I'm actually the lion. In January of 2013, the health authority issued us a legally binding order directing us to provide signage that indicated the rocks were completely off limits for climbing and playing. We had to take corrective action if we saw anybody playing on them. We had to remove the rocks entirely, which of course would have been extremely challenging to do, or make the rocks inaccessible by completely closing them in. So and because it was a legally binding executive order, we had no choice but to comply with the order. So much to the disappointment of many children and many parents, we had to post these signs, and you can see the sign kind of in the background between the two kids, not the signs that they're holding, but It had to be really big, and it was very explicit. And actually, the health authority even came in. They would do sort of spot checks, like mystery shopper kind of things, and they'd bust me, like they'd bust us, you know, when kids were climbing on them. It was just like, oh my gosh, and we were doing our best to make it work. So thinking about the power of the public voice, we thought that might sway the health authority. We surveyed our customers, and actually 95% of our customers said that they perceived the activity to be safe and that their kids absolutely loved it, and they felt that it should be their own personal choice and their decision alone, whether to allow it or not. But unfortunately, the public voice had no influence on the health authority. So why this mattered to us? I mean, it would have been very, very easy to cave to Alberta Health Services' demands, most definitely. There was tremendous, tremendous pressure from many angles. And, you know, interestingly enough, even our legal counsel was reluctant to take on the health authority. And it was very intimidating for our board. We have a 16-member board. They were all served with this legally binding order. And it actually, the situation really polarized our board. It was very interesting. About half the board felt that they supported this strong stance that me and the management team were taking, and about half of them sort of supported the Alberta Health Services stance. So that was quite fascinating. And of course, it raised a lot of organizational governance issues. I mean, was this a board issue to resolve? Was it a management issue? Was it both? So there was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears over this one. Maybe not so much blood, but there was a lot of sweat. And it was also, we recognized it was going to require a huge organizational investment in terms of resources, time, money to deal with this. And, but every time self-doubt crept into our minds, we'd go back to our cause, which was is raising healthier generations. And this was really about advocating for and protecting kids' right to play. In our minds, this was a public policy issue. This was not a safety issue. And so throughout the couple of years, we just stayed the course, and we wanted to be true to our cause, and ultimately that made the decision to challenge the status quo a lot easier. And we also recognized that the outcome would be very precedent-setting. It was going to be very precedent-setting for communities, for schools, for the recreation sector, and we felt that was so important. It definitely gave us great strength to persist. So in January of 2013, Cardell Place actually filed an appeal, and the case was brought before the Provincial Public Health Appeals Board, and it's a quasi-judicial tribunal. And I recruited and retained the best and brightest champions of kids' play. I got Dr. Mark Tremblay out to Calgary. We have a great principal researcher with Mount Royal University, Dr. Dwayne Sheehan, and he's an expert in children's motor skill development. We hired a fellow by the name of Scott McClarty. He's a certified health and safety consultant and a Canadian risk management expert. And we hired alternate legal counsel, if you can believe it. Well, actually, we did, and they did a lot of pro bono work, so it was great. So we developed a rock-solid, evidence-based case, and we were very, very proud of our case. And it hinged on a number of principles. Our safety record was stellar. The rocks have been in play, as I'd mentioned, since we opened in 2004. So literally for 7.5 years, and we had thousands of kids play and climb on those rocks. And you know how many injuries we had in 7.5 years? We had 3 minor injuries. So we put together all kinds of statistical evidence showing all the other injuries that we'd had in the arenas and the pools and the gyms. I mean, we had something like 1,382 injuries in the pool alone in 7.5 years. The rocks were subject to the same facility supervision standard and process as the rest of the facility, so kids had to be supervised by parents when they were playing and climbing on the rocks. And we actually, Scott McClarty did a very thorough quantitative and qualitative hazard and risk assessment and identification. And he concluded that the level of risk exposure was fairly low and suggested that the appropriate risk mitigation techniques was just parental supervision of children. So the conclusion was that the level of risk exposure to children from the activity did not warrant a closure or a ban of the activity. So after extensive preparations and a full-day hearing with the Public Health Appeals Board, their decision ultimately was to direct Alberta Health Services and our organization back to the table, which was interesting because they could have made a decision, other decisions, but they said, we don't think you worked hard enough to work it out, so go back to the table. So, interestingly enough, the health authority actually stuck to their position, which was to mitigate the risks by putting protective padding around the rocks, removing the sharp edges, making them non-slip, doing everything possible to sort of destroy the structure. And it really risked becoming something like this, our poor natural play structure. This is actually a play structure in Las Vegas. And we were just horrified. We're like, oh no, it's going to get so sanitized. So what we ended up doing was in October of 2013, we actually invited Alberta Health Services without conditions to meet with us to co-create a resolution. And in March of this year, interestingly enough, almost 2 years after the original complaint was launched, we reached the following compromise. So this is what's on our rocks. This is not a play structure. Serious or even life-threatening injury may occur as a result of playing on this structure. Now, what's interesting was initially the wording was quite different. They actually had a number of examples of, I think it said death could occur. There were a number of examples, and we actually took it forward to our insurers, to our legal counsel, and we were able to convince Alberta Health Services to take out those examples, because if you don't list every eventuality, then you're actually going to increase your liability. So they agreed that this could go up, but we wanted their logo on it, but of course that didn't happen. we don't want people to think it's us that are putting this signage up, but anyway. So the result is that this negative, fear-instilling, intimidating wording, I mean, obviously it's less than ideal. I remember sending it to Mark Tremblay, and I think he was like, oh, you're kidding me. But we feel that this is actually a very significant public policy victory for kids' right to play, because kids can once again explore and play on these rocks with parental supervision. It's the parent's choice, which is wonderful. It's just parents have to wrap their heads around this sign and what it implies. And we don't have to monitor them, and neither does AHS, which is wonderful. I think they finally just wanted me to go away. So as more and more children return to the rocks to explore and play, the message is really loud and clear. Better a broken bone than a broken spirit. And the Cardell Place spirit has certainly been emboldened, not broken, by this event. We challenged ourselves in a very big way. We challenged the regulations and the regulator. And we didn't accept the system's answer. We worked really boldly and very creatively to find the right answer for kids and for parents, and we're very proud of it. It was very risky, and yes, I still have my job, but it was right, and I would do it again in a heartbeat, because again, we have to get out of kids' way and let them play. So that's the story. Thanks for your attention.